What's up, guys? So today we have Alex Bromley back on the podcast. A really impressive strongman. He's got a great YouTube channel with a big following. We went into a lot of topics today, not just as far as lifting, but also the psychology behind it, maintenance, whether it's a good idea to have the mindset that you should always be striving for more and more progress. A lot of great topics here, and we're going to have part one on my channel, part two on his channel. So make sure you check out both.
All right, everybody. So today, back on the podcast, we have Alex Bromley. How we doing, Alex?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. We talked, I think it was this year, it's about 7 or 8 months ago. It was great chatting with you. I don't actually remember how we first connected. I'm sure I reached out maybe on like Instagram or something. But I remember some of the comments at that time were that you had hit 100,000 subscribers. And now you're close to 200, right? I mean, you've had some pretty good growth.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate, but I've been hitting the gas a lot in trying to like consolidate on like a template for like the type of content and how I'm focusing videos. And I think I finally figured some things out. I've been putting out videos for like 6 years. So I tell people I'm a slow learner, but I'm a strong learner. So I think I finally got a handle. And people have always said, once you hit this critical mass, if you're consistent, that it does tend to kind of grow exponentially.
Yeah.
And I found that as long as I'm consistent with the content, that's kind of been true. So yeah, I'm really excited for how the next year is going to go.
Yeah. So what's your primary audience now? Because I'm realizing actually now as we speak, I first came across you because I had seen some of the stuff on like back health, Stu McGill and barbell medicine and all that. And then I guess, it's a lot of strength-based stuff, which of course you still talk about. Some of your more recent videos, I saw you talk about like some just life stuff, some bodybuilding stuff. Where are you focusing most of it now?
So the general focus is it's nebulous. It's on strength in general, which can encompass so many things. So I think I can intuit who my audience is based on which videos tend to do well. And it is kind of a grab bag. For instance, like I just put out a video specifically about bodybuilding
Hmm.
that I dumped a ton of time and effort. It took me like 3 weeks to get it out. Video's not doing so well because it's very
Hmm.
specific. It's very kind of niche over there where I haven't really paid attention specifically to bodybuilding for the last so many years, even though it's very relevant. There's a lot of
Yeah.
crossover, but the branding's a bit different. On the other hand, I branched out into like some men's stuff. I talked about social media and body standards, stuff like that. That video did extremely well. Got a bunch of really positive feedback, a lot of engagement, little bits of life advice or cautionary tales from my experience have done well. So my demographics, it's primarily men. It's in kind of the sweet spot of what you would expect for lifters, kind of like 18 to like 35 is like most of the people.
Yeah.
So I do like to focus on things that I think are relevant to that group. And there's lots to talk about. I think there's a lot of stuff that goes along with being a man and being a lifter and the reason why we end up trying to focus on self-improvement to such a crazy degree.
Yeah.
But yeah, it very much is kind of a grab bag of, a little bit of strength, a little bit of hypertrophy, but not too much. And just trying to kind of walk that middle line.
Yeah, it can be interesting when you have such a strong focus on one thing and you try to bring something else in. Like I remember maybe the first year and it was like all bodybuilding, natural bodybuilding scene. And then even if it was just like I had brought on an enhanced power lifter. And at that point, most of my following had come from natural bodybuilding. And this guy had like a nearly 700-pound bench. I mean, just like crazy lifts and just very little engagement. And you just think like this is still lifting, and this is, but it can be very specific.
That's absolutely right. It's funny. I just had an interview with Sam Sheether a couple weeks ago, and I have a video with him and it's a big bench compilation from all the nuggets of wisdom I pulled out between him and Dennis Arnold, who are both just freak bench pressers. But Sam was saying the exact same thing that he went. I can't remember if he said he went on Alpha Destiny's channel, Alex Leonidas.
Mhm.
I can't remember specifically who, but it was somebody in that sphere. And he was talking about just getting roasted
Yeah.
because they're like, what's this gear monkey doing?
Oh God.
Trying to give advice to natties. And it is kind of a testament to what social media does and YouTube, for better or worse. It very much allows people to hunker down, but what they're hunkering down into as far as a label, it can mean a lot of different things, and it doesn't always end up in a very productive pattern. So, I always tell people there aren't exactly a different set of rules from one to the other, even though there's obvious differences. It has an effect. It's like not enough information. It's kind of like differentiating between men and women for training. You
Mhm.
can do it that there's a difference,
Yeah.
but I've never met somebody that has their file for men and file for women because it's not enough information.
Right.
So anyways, but yeah, the labeling thing and how people kind of self-identify, it very much plays into the culture, but also like what I have to do to run a channel and what you've
Yeah,
experienced
right.
as well, you know.
I think the biggest area I see it even more so is with nutrition and diets, because with lifting, I mean, for sure, you do get some people who are really, really just staunch on the whole like natty thing, and they just won't listen to anybody who's not like a noble natty and whatnot, as they say. I do see that, but for the most part, I do think among lifters, there's good camaraderie. But the diet stuff, like I don't know how detailed you get with the diet information, but some of the comments I see on like vegan versus carnivore, it's really amazing. Like, I mean, it's just like all logic goes out the window. And I read it and I don't think these people are intentionally incendiary. I just think they actually believe what they're saying. And it's like, I mean, just for example, somebody posts something about like a vegetable being good but like on a carnivore page. And the people, I mean, oh, this is all funded by the government, and this, I mean, like, this is why doctors don't want to cure cancer. And like, I mean, just the level of it is kind of amazing.
God, that requires like a PhD I don't have, you know, and like because I think about it all the time, like fundamentally, it's a big problem of our time, right? How to navigate something like our life on the internet where we have so much information and we can engage and communicate. And there should be all this amazing stuff coming out of it. But ultimately, it's like the worst parts of ourselves that get selected for.
Right.
So anything, it really is anything that triggers an emotional response. And it is directly kind of to how we self identify. I was thinking about this earlier today because everybody intuitively thinks that um, the way that they solve problems or the way that their gut instinct works, the way that they assign like principles or morality to things is solid. And it's like, I feel like any kind of superficial deep dive into psychology shows that we are very crude machines that rely
Yeah.
on pretty shitty pattern recognition. And I think most people would be shocked to know like exactly what's driving that decision making. The one thing I always try to keep in mind, because I'm terrible at this, in full transparency, I preach because it's like a projection of like the things that I struggle with. I'm horrible online. I
Yeah.
am not good in the comments. People probably see a disconnect between how I am in person and how I act on the comments, and it's something I'm actively working on because somebody says something that I think is ill informed, and if it's done in a very like brash way, it's like, okay, well that has to be put down, and it doesn't even matter if you're right or if you have the authority. It's like the precedent it sets with
Yeah.
having conversations, which we have to have in perpetuity, like constantly. So it's like kind of doing the hard thing, tying one hand behind your back. But yeah, basically that means not being an a-hole to everybody and understanding that there's complexity to stuff, and it's an extremely difficult problem to tackle.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that because I actually do remember when we first spoke, and I said how I came across you in the comment section, and I was impressed with it. I because
Oh,
because you had said, oh, I guess I came across the right comments, because I said how you were very well put together and you had a very nice rational response, which I guess maybe was not the norm at the time or something. But no, I thought it was well handled, at least what I saw. But I have a strong, I guess, temptation to respond in certain ways to certain comments that I see online. And sometimes I will type it up and then I just delete it. I almost never do. I mean, I do on my own videos. I'll respond to people, which most of the comments I get are nice, but I just mean in general on the online fitness space, I see it and I just think I just can't bring myself to waste that much time on it. But the desire to do it is definitely there.
that's the most like mature thing, and I try to like reward myself when I do that because I have typed like paragraphs in, and I've always tried to rationalize it like this is writing practice, this is me coming up
Yeah.
with quips or like kind of reasserting what I know or how I know it. So there's kind of a value of engaging with that, but it's like the order of magnitude is way off, and that having good conversations takes work. It's not easy. It's like sparring, right? You don't go out and start throwing haymakers. Everybody's kind of trying to improve their skill and their knowledge off of each other. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to do. But as far as like the identity thing with like the diet thing, I have no idea why it is that way. I know exactly what you're talking about. There's some streamers I started following, and I never thought I would be the guy to watch streamers, but
Yeah.
I do, but like Vegan Gains pops up every now and
Oh
then.
man, he's still around?
Yeah, he's still around, but it's not, I don't even know as far as lifting, but he gets involved with like, and I don't know anything about him other than he pops up on some other popular streams. But
Okay.
I've seen just enough of his content. There's like a level of unhinged. It's
Oh yeah.
extremely entertaining, and I think, kind of perpetuates the attention that he gets.
Yeah,
But
man.
also when you hear the way that the arguments get formed, it's like, what is it about your adherence to eating something that allows you to pull in this sense of like superiority? I know what it feels like to feel superior. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
That's another thing that you have to battle with, kind of keep your head on straight. But it's like really like veganism, or and like you said, the same thing, like the carnivore diet. I'm hearing a lot of that nowadays too. It's very bizarre. People will find their in, I think, wherever they can.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the issues with both lifting and nutrition is it's very anecdotal, and especially with nutrition, I mean, it's extremely anecdotal because it's a lot of epidemiology studies and whatnot. But even with lifting, I mean, there's actually, I'm going to put out a video soon, and it's just some commentary that Jeff Nippert had mentioned how, people compare themselves to somebody and they say, oh, well, if they're enhanced, then I want to know if they're enhanced or not, so that I can decide or figure out if I can achieve what they can achieve. And his point was, well, obviously genetics are a huge factor too, right? And that's totally true. My video will kind of get into some of the other confounders there, but the point being that there's so many big factors beyond just like your split of how you're training or your like macronutrients that it becomes very difficult outside of like highly powered long-term studies to be able to determine these things. So when it comes to like a diet, it's like, well, this worked for me, kind of a thing. I do understand why people gravitate towards it. It's more like the cult aspect of it that I think people, like you said, the identity that comes from it, and almost inevitably, and this goes back to different psychological principles. When I don't want to say everybody, but generally, when you see somebody who is so extremist and has a lack of nuance, you generally view that person as less knowledgeable and less intelligent because you lack the ability to form that nuanced argument and viewpoint, right? I mean, most people who are really intelligent don't have such a staunch view in a certain way with something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Generally, that's a pretty good heuristic to go off of, right? Like if you're smart enough to engage with the complexity, or at least to recognize it, that's probably going to come out in how you talk about things. But the other thing that makes that complex is I've met some incredibly intelligent people that are also themselves unhinged, and
Yeah,
the way I liken it to this, like imagine that you're taking the SATs. Well, I guess there's bad test takers, right? People that get anxiety. But imagine you're taking a standardized test and you're solving a word problem. Honestly, take away the stress. Imagine you're doing a Sudoku problem on an airplane, and imagine that your heart rate is at 180 and you feel your chest like up in your ears, like with your blood pressure, like that sensation you get when you're heated. And I've seen that enough times. I mean, I've experienced it myself at times, but it's like when your brain goes to that point, it's like it doesn't matter how much horsepower you have in there
yeah,
because all that's shut off or it's like going somewhere else. Um, so I'm inclined to think it is a problem with, I mean, the less intelligent you are, I think the more likely you are to lack the impulse control or to have
yeah,
the self-awareness. I think that's absolutely true. But the really insidious thing about it is I think that actually impacts a lot of really smart people as well. And there's like, I have this desire to like stop everything about lifting and just focus on social media with like the documentary, The Social Dilemma and all that stuff, because I'm fascinated by it, but also like being engaged with this stuff. It's like so in your face at all times, and you feel like a responsibility to like engage with this stuff. And
yeah,
then when you add in, like you said, the studies, because again, it's like an identity error, kind of an air of superiority, because you want to be able to go with the data, but also the fact that it's like vague or not complete, or there are a lot of confounding variables involved with it, and it does require very careful discussion. It allows for just an absolute cluster of people making strong opinions that aren't really foundationally based in anything, cherry picking anecdotes, cherry picking data, misinterpreting conclusions. And it's hard. And I'm always interested to talk to people like you that have a more thorough education. I'm sure you've done your share of like evaluating research. I mean, I don't have a degree, but I've dicked around in college enough to like have taken lab classes and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And if you're being honest about what the limits are of the field, like what's holding back exercise science, it's very much lack of participation. Even if you had all the participation in the world, lack of being able to define the thing you're talking about, to be able to measure it. I mean, the amount of people that you would need, I've gone on this rant 100 times, but the amount of
Yeah,
people
yeah.
that you need to get some type of like unified theory of training would be at more people than have ever lived on the planet. You just have, you need to have them observed and running through. I mean, just think of all the variables that go into training. Then each variable, how many different ways you can run it.
Right.
It's like there would be an unlimited, and I think we'd be 0.5% better for all that work.
Yeah, yeah. And just to back up a bit, I should clarify, I definitely don't think that being intelligent makes you immune
Sure.
to some of these extreme views at all, right? I mean, whether we're talking politics or diet, there's very intelligent people on both sides. And that's what can make it more confusing to me when I see somebody who is really intelligent, who has some pretty radical view, and it's just like, man, like most things have significant nuance to them, right? I mean, but yeah, when it comes to like the studies, I mean, I studied exercise science in undergrad, and I was part of 2 research studies, and it's I don't want to say they're all bad. I mean, they're definitely not all bad, but it is not necessarily as rigorous as you might see in like some larger studies. And something that's like funded by a hospital that's got like 10,000 people over like 5 years. That is not what's happening on college campuses on a lot of these studies. It's very different.
And yeah, and I think the further people are away, because that's another point where people, I don't want to name names. I got into a kind of a heated back and forth with an individual he's pretty well known, but he's very given to relying on the data and using that to kind of sharpen his sword that he goes out and stabs people on the field with. And
name names, Alex. This is
this self-preservation.
Yeah, right.
No, but I don't want to start more shit than I need to. No. Yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't know if that's ever a standard I've upheld, but I'm gonna uphold it now. No, but it was the way that it gets talked about, and I feel like you can't have this perspective of it if you've ever been close to the field. Like if you've seen how this stuff goes off, if you know, like when people are in the decision making mode, figuring out what they're testing, what their potential sources of errors are going to be. Sometimes when people are just in that position where they have to turn in work and they're like, F it, it's fine. There's like a good amount of kind of settling for like the best thing you can do at the moment.
Yeah.
And you take that out enough times, like people can't even agree on what failure means. Mm-hmm. It's like people don't even like have a really good way of making sure they know somebody is actually taking it. There's so many variables between one person and another. So anyways, as you get closer to it, you see how things branch off. And it makes it, in my opinion, it would make it very, very hard to be a part of that field and then represent it in an absolute way. And that's one of the reasons I have a lot of respect when you hear like Schoenfeld or Krieger or Helms, and when they're on interviews, all the guys with PhDs I find are very, very good at saying you cannot use studies to inform your training decisions. That's not their function. That's not what they do. This is part of, a bigger, more long-term thing. But yeah. And then again, that all just, I think, ties right back into people grasping at straws to try to find some footing to kind of represent themselves ahead of the mob online. Right. And it's a problem. I don't know where it's going. It's fun to watch.
Yeah.
If you're kind of an anarchist like me, but
Do you have like, Alex Bromley's unified theory of training? I mean, after so many years training so many people, do you find like, no, I really believe that these are the principles that lead to the best results? Or is it just like, hey, like, you got to work hard for a long time and that's going to be most of it?
So I don't want to get too like, meta physics here, but it's like there's different levels to answer that question on, because when I think about like what the true answer to that would be, it would be something that can reliably point to an individual, take into account who they are, what their genetics are, what their psychology is, and say, given everything we know about you, we know for a fact that this approach to training is such a percent more likely to give you best results long term. And it would probably go a step above that and chart exactly how people adapt over time, because a big factor for when you plateau or stop growing is the most recent thing you've adapted to. So, something like a broad recommendation like volume. That's why I lose my mind, because you have like bodybuilders that are used to talking about training variables. Like there's an optimal range and then you just stay there.
Right.
Which isn't what you do in any competitive sport, like anywhere in the world, right? It's like you go through phases, you compartmentalize things that you're focusing on and give them priority, and then you switch, you transition over time. And given how people adapt, like so, anyways, it's the individual genetic variation, which I feel like we're not going to get to the bottom of until we can have quantum computers that, like, you punch in the genome and run a billion simulations and see what happens. But then in addition to that, you need the complexity of time, which is one of the most difficult things, because whatever was optimal for you your first year or at 5 years in, it's not going to be optimal 6 months from now. It's not going to be optimal years down the road, unless you're talking about something very broad, something broad where there's a lot of wiggle room in the middle, like progressive overload. Like, of course, progressive overload works, but that's because there's a million different ways you can apply it. But the exact same things work. So anyways, if I'm taking it down from that, okay, we can't do that. What's the recommendation for people given all the things we don't know and we'll probably never know? It is a recommendation of hard work. It just seems like working your ass off seems to be universally the thing that's going to set people apart more than anything. That's actually a change of heart for me recently, because I remember my years being burnt out because that's all I was doing. And it wasn't until I learned how to throttle back and organize better and pay attention that I actually improved and stopped getting injured, by the way. But that's a personal bias of mine. There are people like that. And again, I was talking to Sheether about this. He had a great point. He's like, it's a much better problem to have where you just hit the gas and you're going, you're growing like a weed. And then you run into trouble, to where we can say, okay, now let's dial it back. Let's pivot. Let's take that and focus it somewhere else. Then taking somebody who's real finicky over their training or expects the organization of training to have all the answers, instead of hitting the gas, because that's a hard thing to teach. It's a hard thing to foster, especially when you think of people, and I've dealt with a lot, who have started with barbells and they'll do 25 sets of deadlift technical practice, but you can't get them to put any effort on a tricep press down or on a single leg, Bulgarian squat or something. So effort's probably the biggest one. And then beyond that, I mean, good exercise selection, which we pretty much know. Having some kinesthetic awareness of your body, so striving to be technical. That doesn't mean being surgically precise and constantly screwing with your stuff, but passable technique that is within an acceptable margin. And then just taking notes so that over time you can pay attention to what specific changes actually led to a good result. And I think that's where people struggle the most, because if you can retain stuff that worked well for you and make adjustments accordingly and note the results, that's the best possible thing you can do. But that's extremely hard. Yeah. So everything I've done up until this point with programming, it's a good framework. I think it has good stuff packed into it. I think it addresses a lot of problems that people have. And I think it's important to wrap your head around all the different options. But really, I don't think anything beats hard work and just figuring out how you tick.
Yeah, I would agree. Most of my first 10 years was, I wasn't the guy who was jumping around routine to routine, because I knew that was not ideal. And I didn't believe that there was some golden ticket, but I always, to some degree, it may be good early on to be a little delusional about what's possible, right? Because you then push even harder. But it was definitely trying to find that optimality. And I more and more believe that it really is, obviously genetics are huge. If somebody is taking performance enhancing drugs, that's huge. But beyond that, it's like consistency and hard work. And that you mentioned, like, within like reasonable margins, right? That's obviously, you can't have something that's just like abysmal. But you got like a B+ routine and you're super consistent with it and you're really pushing hard, that's going to beat an A+ routine if you're inconsistent, every week. So
I agree. Yeah. It's the mistake of, it's diminished returns exist in everything. It's, even if there was something you could define that is optimal, the amount of work you would find, the amount of work it would require for you to find it and then consistently apply it would just be, I mean, the extra benefit you would get, it gets so razor thin that it doesn't even make sense. And then it's a crapshoot if chasing that little margin at the top, that little razor thin margin, if that's worth all the other things that you're tending to forget about. So I always go back to focus on the big things. You're doing the big things. Uh, People online in the comments, new trainees, they get furious when you go back to like work hard, sleep. Are you sleeping enough? Are you drinking enough water? Are you eating? Because they're like, yeah, no shit. But especially now, it merits that pivoting back because there has been so much discussion about the high-minded stuff that there probably does need to be a big kind of back to the earth. Like, look, you want to find one thing that separates two groups of people that's going to dictate this group doing way better over time than this group besides steroids. It's going to be who loves to train.
Yeah.
I really think that's the case. It's who loves to be there and just gets off on every bit of progress, every bit of effort they put out. I had the biggest gains when I was a teenager using it as a form of self-harm. Like it was just taking all my stuff out on myself. And that over time, it led to good results. And yeah, it got to the point where it was unsustainable, but then that's when the shift happened. So yeah, it's a lot to consider.
Yeah, I talk to clients about this all the time, and I say, look, like we have to get you to. I don't. Not everybody's necessarily going to have the same path I did, but you have to get to the point that you're enjoying this. I don't know anybody who does it for 10 plus years, and every time they go, they're just like, oh, this sucks. I got to get this out of the way. Um, I guess I'm kind of like when I think of cardio, like I've consistently done on average like 2 sessions of cardio a week for well over a decade, basically my entire training career. And I don't like it. And I do it for, like health and just, a little, I'm not super active in terms of step count. And so I think it's like good for me to do that. So I guess there's exceptions, but even that is within the framework of this overall thing. I mean, overall, I very much enjoy being a fit person. And I just think if somebody's like, yeah, it just sucks every time I go, I just don't think that's gonna be consistent, long term.
Yeah, cardio is a special beast because I don't know anybody that it's one thing to love running. Like
Mhm.
I run periodically. Thank God my feet are shaped the way they are because I'm 265 and I can go run a couple miles on concrete and I'm fine. I
Wow.
know I know a lot of people get shin splints and stuff. Anyways, I see the benefit. I've promoted it. I enjoy running. That's a different thing than like I have a bodybuilder friend and his card. It's an hour incline specifically at a slow walk, like
Mm.
intentionally. And it's like it's like Chinese water torture as
Yeah.
exercise.
Yeah.
And it's just like, yeah, I don't think it ever gets easy. But, that serves a broader thing that you do love. You do love chipping
Right.
away at your physique, right? You do love getting stronger. You do love seeing where you can take it. So even there's that kind of surge of satisfaction that comes from that, which I think is enough. I don't think you have to, I don't think it's reasonable or healthy for people to expect that they love in the moment every single thing that they do.
Sure.
Um,
Totally.
you got to be able to do hard things. But like, I mean, as far as you, like what along your journey, like what were some of the epiphanies you found when you were piecing things together?
In terms of effectiveness or in terms of things that made me enjoy it?
Oh, I mean, but both are good, but like, let's start with effectiveness.
Yeah, so I was fortunate that I early on had good influences. I mean, I like the book that got me into it was Body for Life by Bill Phillips. That was like my dad gave me that book, the red book with all the before and after pictures on and all that,
I have it on my shelf. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Looking back at those, the transformations actually might be more impressive to me now than at the time. Like some of these guys, I'm like, are these natural transformations or were these in the time that they said it was? Because some of these are really impressive. Um, but in any case, so I read that, man, I was 13 to 14. I was like freshman in high school, I guess it would have been. And I was just hooked, man. Like I was so into that. But that book does focus on progressing over time. I don't think that the nutrition advice was as good in the sense that they talked about this cheat day every week, and that definitely, took a turn for the worse for me early at a young
Sure.
age. I actually, I'm very big on like if I write something down or say I'm going to do it, I do it. And so I remember it was like the last year I had gone away to like a camp or anything like that, and I was like, oh, I'm going to be away for a week, so I'm going to save a week of cheat days for that time, like just not totally understanding the concept of what they were for, and obviously ridiculous. And like I basically had 7 weeks of very low calories and doing that. So just a funny story there, but but the point is he had progressive overload and good nutrition early on. Then I was on the T Nation forums, and there was a forums, Iron Addicts forum. Ever hear of that?
It's familiar. I haven't been on it, but I've heard of
Yeah. And it was big on, again, like big progressive overload, high protein, all of that stuff. So I was fortunate to never fall into like the supplement trap, or like just like the fluff and pump kind of training. So people have heard my channel, and it's very they've heard it a million times that I say, focus on like big key lifts, progressive overload over time. Dante Trudell, like his influence, like DC training was big, of like, again, like heavy slag iron. So ultimately, while I've done a lot over the years, and I actually find less is important than I initially thought in terms of all those little details. So just getting stuff that's consistent and progressing, because I think, going back to the aspect of what makes you enjoy it, a lot of people are really driven by progressing, whether that is progressing in their lifts, progressing in their physique, progressing in their job, something that makes you move towards a meaningful goal. And so this is what I have a problem with, these routines of like, oh, like I just really felt a burn in this, or this felt good. It's like that's great for like that day. The soccer mom goes to the Pilates class or whatever. It's like, oh, that just felt something. But I think that can get boring quickly, or you're always chasing that thing that feels good that time. Whereas when you have a goal that feels like meaningful progress, you talked earlier about like, you need to get comfortable with not everything is going to feel good. And that's when something that can feel so bad, like a 20 rep breathing squat or something like that, can also feel good, because you're like, man, when you finish that set, that accomplishment, you beat what you did before. You really have to tap into the psychology of the clients to get them. That's like my main goal when I have a client, is like, how do I get this person to feed off of each workout, and get that, really, that with that win, as like cliche as that kind of sounds.
Yeah, the power of association. I'm thinking back to every self-help, like productivity book I've ever
Yeah,
read.
yeah.
The power of association is a real thing. And I made the comment about not being expected to love everything you do in the moment, but you can absolutely, over time, by connecting the thing you do love, the thing you do want, with an activity that gets you closer to that, you can connect those very closely to the point where you eventually do feel that love and satisfaction. I remember being a teenager, and by the way, my first influence was Body for Life too. The before and after pictures, that's some deadly marketing. That was like some of the most effective marketing I've ever seen, because I know what you're talking about. They're holding the newspapers, and I would just stare at them.
Yeah.
And I was a fat kid, so I was like, "There's
Same.
hope."
Yeah.
But working up, pyramiding up to that one hard set, and then like kind of the seesaw of cardio of like going, 5, 6, 7 miles per hour back down. That's how I ran all my cardio when I was a teenager.
Same.
And it was stimulating, it was fun, and it worked. But yeah, as far as association goes, I remember being a teenager in like a 24-hour fitness, and I'd only been squatting for a couple of years. And I want to say I had something like the mid 200s on the bar, and I remember racking it specifically because it felt like it was going to crush me. I was in the middle of a set. I knew for a fact I had a couple of reps left, but the sensation of breathing hard, having the weight on me, triggered kind of a panic, kind of a screw this, I'm done. And I racked it. I remember racking it and just kind of dwelling on like the sensation of giving up. You feel like you're a wimp. You're giving up. You are one step further away. It's like your goal is that much farther away from you now, and it's a terrible feeling. But I remember, like, I didn't really let that get to me. I found ways to carry on with my workout. I kept coming back, and it was like so much time, months, maybe years down the road. And I remember never getting that feeling ever again with a squat, even with a max effort, blood vessels breaking, turning bright purple, like I'm about to stroke out. There was just a point where you adapt to this thing. It's not just that you're physically strong enough to move it, but your perception of effort changes. Your perception of like how you internalize what it is to strain to and beyond what you're physically capable of doing. It changes. And a big part of that was, I think, the desire to experience it in the first place. Like, I want these goals, and eventually every PR, every time you do another rep, every time a little more weight goes on the bar, it just reinforced like I'm moving, I'm getting there. There's a reason for all of this. And before long, like, my entire perception of hard work changed. So it's a very real thing. And I don't know how you get clients there, because if you had that trick where you could
Yeah.
put somebody in a trance, you'd be raking in tens of millions of dollars. The best I found is like, one, telling them that that is a thing they can expect. Like, hey, if you stick around, like, it doesn't suck every time. And two, if you can connect that association, it makes really difficult things not suck, which means you're just that much more likely to succeed.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the guilt of a set that was ended too early, or like a skipped workout. Like I have, and I think I don't know if I've actually gone back and forth on if I think it's good or not, because sometimes I'm like, oh, it's like you're too hard on yourself, but then that guilt kind of forces you to keep going, and not just with lifting, but just generally. I can think of a specific time. It was either early this year or last year, and I was late to get home, and I really just wanted to skip this workout. And I was like tired, I was sleep deprived, and I just really wanted to, and I just couldn't. I was so frustrated with myself at the idea of skipping it that I was like, if I skip this, I'm just not even going to be able to relax. And that's probably not good all the time. There are probably times where it's like there's so much buildup, maybe you just need to take a little bit of time off. And I think just as I mentioned earlier, if I say I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. If I write down a goal, I'm going to do it. So if I plan a week off, that's fine. If I plan to have like a free meal or whatever, that's fine. But like same thing, like if I plan to be on a diet, I just couldn't not do that. I couldn't last minute be like, no, you know what, I'm just going to have some pizza or something. Part of me thinks that has allowed me to be successful, but part of me thinks like that psychology is maybe not always the best, and I go back and forth on that.
So that, I mean, what do you think about that coming from? Because you sound like a very organized and deliberate person who you finish what you start. I was the opposite. I'd
Mm.
have my friend who was in college to be a clinical psychologist tell me, you never finish what you start. Like, go get a puzzle. Just as an exercise, go get a puzzle and finish it. So you know what it feels like.
Yeah,
I was like, and I wasn't like a kid. I was like 27. And
yeah,
um, but as you look out into the world, especially right now, there's got to be a word for this where you have like these battling truisms. Like, one is um, standards are important. You want to succeed, you have to hold high standards, have high expectations, be your worst critic. Where another one is like, hey, if you do this, you're going to get an eating disorder,
yeah,
or
yeah.
you're going to be miserable, or you're not going to love or appreciate the finer things. I mean, how do you tackle that, or how do you like perceive that with like exceptional performers, knowing that if you have to exceed in college, if you have to exceed out in the workforce, you need that, but also there's some unknown balance that has to take place to make sure people don't go off the deep end.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I still am figuring that out personally because, like I have two of my own businesses, and it's it depends on the frame that I have it in, right? So like my whole like podcast and YouTube channel and everything, I look at that as something to be enjoyed. And so I set the goal of like, one video a week or one post a week or whatever, but it's not in the same context of like this is work towards a goal. Whereas like my like primary business, sometimes I'll talk to friends who are in the same line of work, and and they're like, oh, like you're still at the office. It's 9 o'clock. Like, what are you doing? Like, I will routinely be at the office until 9 or 10 o'clock. And I think it's just because it's like I look at what should be done to do it optimally or properly. And if it's not done, I think, well, then how am I supposed to relax? Because it's not done yet. The stuff is not completed. And again, I don't want to sit here and act like my entire life is like this and I'm just high achieving in every second. That's not what I'm saying. But if that's the context of what we're talking about, then it is. And that does make it hard for me to like enjoy weekend. I mean, as like somebody who's like got your own business as well, you're never really done, right? There's no 9 to 5. You check out and you just go home, right? There's always a video you could make. There's always an article you could write. There's always marketing you could do. Um, and with my personality type, that has allowed me to be successful with it. But there are times where like, man, like it would be nice to just be able to turn that off and have a 3-day weekend where I don't think about it. And I think sometimes people look at the people who are the most, again, like by standard, like society standards, they're the highest achieving people. And they think, oh, that's a really great thing to have. I want that. But with that comes increased stress and responsibility and things that I don't think those people are necessarily happier. I think they maybe are more proud of what they've accomplished, which is great in and of itself. But I don't know if, like, certainly the day to day is not happier.
Yeah, I mean that's a theme, right? With the highest performers. It's like how many well-adjusted you know, CEOs of multi-billion dollar companies are there, or how many I mean, it's like we kind of stand on the shoulders of people that have like martyred themselves to like
Yeah.
whatever the next great discovery is, right? That because those are the people that have like the technological breakthroughs, those are the people that change the standard, that they go insane and shatter some physical barrier everybody thought was impossible. Um, I think not all the time, but if you're going to try and draw a crude pattern, you're probably going to find they tend to be a little less well adjusted.
Yeah.
And then it's a question of like, okay, is that supplementing something? Are there people? I mean, I think so much about the way people tend to be wired when you really consider how people function differently. Does the idea of contentedness even make sense as a
Yeah.
universal idea? Because if you have a brain where it's just a basket of monkeys, it's like, what does contentedness even mean to you? You know, it's like, do you have to use drugs to induce that? Is it
Right.
something you have to train, or are you just better off going when you feel like going? And some of it's a standard I hold myself to, knowing it's like this fixed North Star that I'm never going to get, but it doesn't, I'm better for trying to strive it, knowing I'll always fall short. The friends I know, the people in my life I know that are like that, where I am very much, I'll take a rest when I need it. And I know people that they're just on 24/7. And it's inspiring to watch. Like it is inspiring to know what somebody is capable of doing. Like if you have to do that, like, hey, you don't need 7 hours or 6 hours of sleep every night. Like, hey, you actually can work 10 or 12 hours in pursuit of this thing that's really, really important to you, you know, hoping that it's optional and it's not something you're forced to do by necessity, which I know some people are. But yeah, people are wired differently, and I don't even know how to tackle that. And that's the thing I think when trying to figure out what the general answer is for a hard question like that. Like, how do you balance going crazy to be a high achiever with having something that looks like mental health? And there's no way that's a one size fits all type of solution. It has to be individual. And that's, again, things that I struggle with trying to communicate to people. If I'm writing a story or making a video, there's a theme that I want to touch on. And in no way, shape, or form do I think it's like the universal theme for everybody. But if you're watching the video, you'll probably feel like that's meant to apply to you, or that's a critique of you individually. So if I am talking about something like having standards, having a work ethic, like I don't necessarily think the problem with society is generally people being overworked. Not to say they don't exist, or that isn't in its own capacity a thing, but um, it's very hard because you can't draw that blanket over everybody. And really solving somebody's problems individually, it does require something a little more surgical.
Yeah. Well, and related, I'd love to get your opinion on this because sometimes, and this is something I think about often, is how much of what we think we want is even in reality the outcome that we would want, or the path that we'd want to get to that outcome. So, like, let's talk about somebody who's maybe not, by his own admission, less well adjusted. So, Peter Attia.
Yeah.
So Peter Attia, right? Big podcast, The Drive. I like his podcast. He had a book come out, Outlive. That was a great book. And you look at that, you could say, hey, like, would you want to be a successful doctor turned successful podcaster who's got all this stuff and he's talking to like some of these brightest minds and whatnot? And like, with two people who have YouTube channels, like, yeah, that sounds really cool. But then he'll go into his whole thing of it. He has entire life of, like therapy and really not being well adjusted at all. And like a lot of self-hatred, like literally just like cursing himself off and all those things. And you're like, oh, wow. Like, but that's kind of in line with what you were saying before, right? With some of these, we stand on the shoulders of giants and whatnot. And I think like bringing it back to lifting a little bit, it's like, or like, do you watch MMA at all?
Yeah, I have before. Yeah.
So like I'm a big UFC fan, and you look at that, yo, yeah, that'd be cool to be like the heavyweight champion of the world, right? It's like, well, how about the like decade of getting like just the crap beat out of you constantly, the CTE, and then maybe not even getting there? Hey, that would be cool to be Mr. Olympia. Okay, how about like the decade long run of drug abuse and the side effect and the shortened life and the psychological downfall when you have to then come off everything? I mean, like, you see the Instagram snippet of it, and it's like, that's so cool, right? It means like you watch like Dragon Ball Z as a kid, you're like, that's what I want to do, right? Or something. And then reality kicks in of what that is. And it's like, is that necessarily better? And the part that I struggle with is, many religions would talk about this, many philosophers would talk about this, that like, no, it's almost like the goal would be want less and be content with what you have and everything. It's like, but how do you tell that to somebody and just say, no, 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 you have an average job, and you're you got a family, so like that's really important to you, but like your life is pretty average, and being more successful, quote unquote successful, isn't going to benefit you at all. Like it's hard to believe that, because that is not what we look around when we talk about success. What do we think about? We think about outward signs of success, right? I don't even think, like, even as I'm saying this, if somebody told me, no, work half as much, make a third as much money, and, just be okay with an average physique, I don't think I would buy it. And yet,
So, and that brings up a very interesting point, because I think about this, because anytime conversations go into like economics or whatever, like, you know, teenagers and college kids and streamers being socialists is very in vogue right now. So you get a lot of discussions about these kind of like theoretical futures that people are pushing towards. And one of the things that deeply frames, because there's not, especially, I don't know, shit about economics. I didn't spend time dealing with that. So those are areas, society as well, like social stuff. I have to use kind of blunt instruments to kind of intuit what I think is true. And I'll argue those to the best of my ability, knowing full well what my shortcomings are. But the one thing, when I play that thought experiment, what does society look like in a certain situation? I think there's people that are pushing to like a post work society, or something where, hey, we have enough automation, and what are we going to do? Robots are just going to run everything, and we can kind of hang out, and the system just takes care of us, like hamsters at an amusement park. I cannot imagine any well-adjusted society where some work, some grind, something that's expected of you isn't part of your existence. Like I intuit that that's connected to the type of dysfunction that leads to trying to feel anything else, where you just end up constantly altering your conscience with your consciousness with, like, I don't know, drugs or dysfunctional behavior. Anyways, I feel like there very, very much is something deep in people, and it probably has to do with our entire evolutionary history, about working towards something. I mean, anybody looks at a tiger in a cage and they say, well, that's inhumane. It's like, why is it inhumane? The tiger's relaxing. It's not going to die from like breaking an ankle. It's going to live as long as it possibly can. It doesn't have to, it's not food insecure. It's getting fed. It's getting attention. It's fine. But everybody looks at it and they're like, no, it's inhumane because it's not meant to do that. But I work in this office 60 hours a week. You mentioned step counts earlier. Yeah, I get like 5 steps a day. It's like up my stairs in here, and then I'm done. And at least, I mean, my mind is engaged. But when you have somebody who doesn't have to work to chip away at something, I feel like it's very much the same thing. There's kind of an inhumaneness to it, because it's so detached from everything that our brains are kind of wired to do. But then on the complete other end of that, it's like, okay, so is that kind of what human bliss is, though? Is like the endless chasing of something? Because, and it really isn't about the goal. I mean, anybody that's goal oriented knows the goal doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like, you've had goals. How much time do you spend sitting around thinking about all the goals you've checked off?
Yeah. I mean, like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like I could probably list, if I had to, a bunch of things. I'm sure you could too, that I did this. So many people didn't do it. I don't think about that. I think about all the shit I haven't done yet.
Yeah.
And everything's just moving forward. And I think there's a healthiness to that, because the journey is the thing to enjoy, whether it's life or the thing you're working towards. You need a goal to facilitate that journey, even though the goal isn't that important. And then you mentioned like wanting less, kind of that Buddhist philosophy of like, life is pain, and you kind of learned just to deal with it and kind of remove yourself. And I think that's a very, very useful strategy. But what does society look like if everybody's well adjusted? Who's doing the hard shit, man? Who's making new stuff? Like, who's pushing us forward? It's a very, it's like every group of people needs, every population needs its steady percentage of people to kind of be sacrificed for like the good of everybody else. Because if we're all just humming in a circle, like fields aren't getting sown, products aren't being made, warriors aren't staying strong for the event that there's an attack or a raid. Like it's we're stuck in between like our prehistoric past and like some future that we don't even know what it looks like.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, how many multimillionaires do we see where it's like, you could stop right now. Like you could just not do anything else and just kind of chill, but they don't, right? I mean, sometimes they do and then they go back to it, or they get into like, too much drugs and alcohol and all that stuff. But why is Conor McGregor still fighting, right? Why are some, like I knew there was one guy who wrote a real estate book and he became very wealthy. And then after 3 or 4 months of just kind of traveling with his family, he's like, oh, I do want to actually be productive in life, and I think it's, but like you said, it's good for society, right? I mean, it's good for that meaning. I even wonder that, like, with some of these lifters who know that they're maybe not going to progress much anymore, right? Maybe they've been lifting for 20 years, or especially if they were enhanced, now they're not, then of course you're really never going to hit a peak again. But they find new goals to, and I don't know where specifically you are in your lifting journey in terms of like new goals versus past performance, but it's like even on a micro individual level, not no longer like looking at society level, do you have to find lifting goals that make you feel like this is meaningful? Some people have a huge shift from body or like strongman to calisthenics, right? Like that's kind of a natural one as you get older and stuff. Do you think you can take those same principles we talked about on like a grand scale and look at it more on like a micro scale of like even your individual hobbies have to have some progress there?